Please stay.
It's 2 a.m. and the phone rings. Lorenzo Moretti, the feared Mafia boss, had just been pulled from a meeting. A wrong call. But when he arrives at the hospital, everything changes. A single mom, on the brink of losing everything, whispers a desperate plea.
Please stay.
But Lorenzo knows the world he lives in isn't one where anyone stays for long. What happens next will force him to choose between his dangerous past and a future he never saw coming. Hey, if you're loving this story, a quick like or subscribe goes a long way in helping me keep creating. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every message, and it always makes my day. The sterile hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to echo throughout the room. The cold metal of the hospital bed dug into Emily's back as she lay there, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound that kept her tethered to reality. It felt like an eternity since she'd been admitted. Several days of endless tests, medications, and barely there moments of sleep. She was so tired, drained, as if every ounce of strength had been siphoned away by the relentless illness inside her. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for her phone on the bedside table. It was 2:47 a.m. Her mind fogged by painkillers, she struggled to focus on the task at hand. The soft rustling of sheets beside her reminded her of the one thing keeping her going. Lily, her 5-year-old daughter, was curled up in the chair next to the bed, still holding her worn-out teddy bear. Her little face was scrunched up in her sleep, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She looked so peaceful, unaware of the storm brewing around her. Emily had tried everything she could to shield her daughter from the realities of their life. She had always been the one to put on a brave face, even when the weight of the world was too much to carry. But tonight, Emily felt herself breaking. She'd been alone for so long, and the thought of losing Lily, the only person she had left, was unbearable. There had to be someone who could help her, someone who could at least offer her the kind of security that could give her peace of mind. She couldn't keep fighting on her own, not when her body was betraying her. She had the number, scrawled hastily on a napkin and shoved in her purse months ago after that strange encounter, the number of a man she never thought she would call again. Lorenzo Moretti. The name sent a shiver down her spine, though she couldn't say why. She remembered meeting him at the charity gala, his cold, calculating presence, the way his gaze followed her all night. But that was before everything changed, before her diagnosis, before her life unraveled. With shaky fingers, she scrolled through her contacts, finally landing on the number she never thought she'd use. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air, before pressing dial. Her pulse quickened as the phone rang, each second stretching into eternity. The deep voice on the other end of the line jolted her out of her thoughts. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" Her throat tightened. She couldn't speak. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come out. She wasn't supposed to be calling him. She wasn't supposed to be in this position, but here she was, alone, desperate. "Please," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Please, I need help. My daughter, if something happens." Her voice cracked with the weight of her fear. She had no idea what she was asking for, but it felt like her last chance. The line fell silent, and for a moment, Emily thought he might hang up. She didn't know why she thought he would help. He didn't owe her anything. But something in her voice, something in the way she pleaded for help, must have reached him. She heard him shift on the other end, the brief pause hanging heavy in the air. "I'll be there," he said, his tone no longer cold, but something else, something she couldn't quite place. Lorenzo Moretti didn't answer to anyone. He never had. As the leader of the Moretti family, the feared Mafia boss who controlled vast portions of Chicago's underworld, Lorenzo was accustomed to being in control. Every decision he made was calculated, cold, and ruthless. The world of crime had shaped him into the man he was today, a man who had long since buried any trace of vulnerability beneath layers of power and intimidation. He was a force to be reckoned with, feared by rivals and respected by those who worked for him. But tonight, something felt different. The call had come in the middle of a meeting, an inconvenient interruption as he discussed business with his most trusted associates. Blood stained the cuff of his shirt, a reminder of the deal that had gone wrong earlier that evening. He was used to the violence, used to dealing with problems that could only be solved with bloodshed. But this call, it was nothing like the usual business. The trembling voice on the other end of the line had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. There was no hint of manipulation, no pretense, just raw desperation. Lorenzo had lived a life full of loss, loneliness, and regret. He'd buried those emotions, convinced himself that there was no place for them in his world. When he was younger, his younger sister, his only family after their parents were killed in a car accident, had been his everything. But one fateful night while he was out handling business, she died in a hospital alone. Her last words to him still haunted him. "You're never here when I need you." Lorenzo had never been able to forgive himself for not being there. He had promised himself that he would never again let anyone get close enough to hurt him. That was the life he chose, one filled with power, wealth, and an unyielding drive to protect his empire. And yet this phone call, this wrong number from a stranger, had stirred something in him he thought was long dead. Without thinking, he had excused himself from the meeting, ignoring the questions of his men. He didn't need anyone questioning him. This was something personal, something that went beyond the Mafia, beyond his world. This was about a feeling he couldn't name, a sense of responsibility he couldn't ignore. As Lorenzo made his way to the hospital, his mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Why had he agreed to go? What was it about that woman's voice that had made him drop everything? She was just a stranger. He wasn't in the business of helping people. But as he sped through the empty streets of Chicago, his thoughts kept returning to one thing, the fear in her voice, the raw, desperate need for help. He couldn't shake the image of her, a woman who seemed to be on the edge of losing everything. As his car screeched to a stop outside the hospital, Lorenzo felt the weight of his decision settling in his chest. He wasn't the kind of man who made mistakes, who allowed emotions to cloud his judgment. Yet here he was, standing at the entrance of a hospital, uncertain of what awaited him. He thought back to his sister, to the promises he had broken, and he wondered if this was somehow his chance for redemption. But the closer he got to the hospital room, the more conflicted he became. He was used to dealing with threats, to intimidating and manipulating his way through life. He had never played the role of a savior, but tonight he found himself standing on the precipice of something entirely different. For the first time in years, Lorenzo wasn't sure what he was walking into. Was this just another business transaction, or was something more at play? When he walked into the hospital room, the stark, sterile atmosphere seemed to swallow him whole. The lights were dim, the walls too white. Emily lay in the bed, her exhausted body seemingly sinking into the sheets, while Lily slept in the chair beside her, holding onto her teddy bear. Lorenzo couldn't help but notice how fragile Emily looked. She was pale, her body thin from illness, but there was something in her, something resilient, something that made her different from all the other women he had known. He could see the fear in her eyes as she looked up at him. But there was also something else, a quiet desperation, a silent plea for help that resonated deep within him. Lorenzo knew what he had to do. He didn't just walk away from this. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. For the first time in a long while, he wanted to be something else. "I'm here," he said, his voice softer than usual, a rare warmth in his tone. He had no idea how to be what she needed, but he knew he couldn't leave her side. Emily didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure who this man was, but for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief as he sat by her side. There was something about him, something that made her feel safer, even in her weakened state. And as she looked at him, a soft whisper escaped her lips. "Stay." Lorenzo nodded, settling into the chair beside her. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. knowing this was the start of something neither of them had expected. Emily's eyelids fluttered, the sounds around her muffled, distant. She had drifted in and out of consciousness, the world around her nothing more than a haze of hospital beeps and the occasional murmur of a nurse. But now, as she slowly regained awareness, something felt different. The soft click of the door opening was the first sound to cut through the fog in her mind. She blinked, trying to focus on the figure in the doorway, a tall, imposing silhouette framed by the harsh hospital lighting. He stepped into the room with the grace of a man who owned the space he entered, commanding yet without hesitation, like he belonged. Emily's mind struggled to process who this man was, why he was here, or how he had entered without anyone stopping him. Her thoughts felt sluggish, as if her body was dragging her brain through mud. The nurse had been here just moments ago, and the door had been closed tight. There was no one else in the room except him. The figure paused at the foot of her bed, and Emily's heart began to race, a knot tightening in her chest. Who was he? What was happening? And then the question, "Who are you?" whispered from her dry lips, her voice barely audible. The man, his face shadowed but still striking, didn't answer right away. Instead, his dark eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail in one quick, efficient sweep. Emily's heart skipped a beat when he finally met her gaze. "I'm here," he said, his deep voice steady but with an undeniable edge, like it carried weight, like everything about him did. "You called me." Emily blinked, confused. Her mind was foggy and she fought to stay conscious. But pieces were still missing. She hadn't called anyone, at least not intentionally, and yet there was a strange, undeniable sense of calm that washed over her as she stared at him, his presence somehow both terrifying and oddly comforting. He took a step forward, his polished black shoes making no sound on the hospital floor. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, a stark contrast to the sterile, faded surroundings of the hospital room. Everything about him was clean, controlled, as though he didn't belong in a place like this. Lorenzo Moretti. The name surfaced in her mind like a distant echo from a forgotten conversation. The nurse who had been standing at the door moments ago appeared flustered. Emily barely noticed her, but the nurse's reaction was telling. She seemed too intimidated to question this man. She stood in the hallway now, eyes wide and uncertain. Lorenzo's gaze shifted to the chair beside Emily's bed, where Lily still slept, curled up tightly, holding onto her teddy bear as if the small, worn bear was the only thing keeping her grounded in this world. A small pang of emotion hit Emily's chest, but it was quickly pushed aside by the fog of pain. She was too tired, too lost in her own thoughts to make sense of this. But Lorenzo had already seen her daughter, and something about that made Emily's chest tighten. Was this man a threat? Was he here to take Lily from her? She was about to speak again, to question him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just looked at him, bewildered, hoping the answers would somehow form on their own. Lorenzo seemed to notice her silent confusion. He stepped closer to the bed, his movements fluid, deliberate, like he had a purpose. His gaze softened, but there was no warmth in his eyes, just an intensity that made Emily feel vulnerable, exposed. For a moment it was as if he were seeing right through her, peeling away all the layers of illness, of helplessness, and of fear that had taken hold of her. His eyes flicked to Lily again, then back to Emily. "She's safe," he said, more of a statement than a question. His voice was low, like a promise. And though Emily didn't know him, didn't know why he was here, she wanted so badly to believe him. Lorenzo looked like he was about to leave. She saw him shift slightly, his posture easing as if he had done what he came for, but then as he turned toward the door, Emily's hand shot out. Weak but desperate. "Stay," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Please, just until morning. She's scared of hospitals." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, like she had no right to ask him for anything, let alone to stay. But there it was, a plea, a request for comfort, for someone to be there bare when everything else felt so uncertain. Lorenzo paused, his back still facing her. There was a long silence before he turned around, his gaze meeting hers again. There was no question in his eyes, no hesitation this time. For the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't driven by his need to control, by the violence that had shaped his life. He had always lived by the mantra that no one needed him, that he needed no one. But something in her eyes, something in the way she spoke, made him want to stay. For reasons he couldn't explain, he wasn't ready to walk away, not just yet. Without a word, he pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down beside Emily's bed. He didn't say anything further. His presence in the room was enough. Lorenzo's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. He had never been one for staying, for offering anything of himself to anyone. His life had been built on survival, on the unyielding need to protect his empire. He had no use for weakness, and he certainly didn't have the time for this fragile woman who seemed so small beneath the weight of her illness. But when he sat there watching her struggle for breath, hearing the soft sounds of Lily's breathing as she lay beside her mother, something stirred in him, something unexpected. It was as though this woman, this little girl, had unlocked a part of him he thought he had buried long ago. He couldn't place it. This protective instinct, this urge to keep them safe. But it was there, growing stronger the longer he stayed. His life had always been defined by violence, by power, by the underworld that had shaped him into a weapon, an unfeeling machine. He had made choices that led him down a dark path. But now, sitting in this sterile room with the rhythmic sound of the heart monitor and the quiet shuffle of footsteps outside the door, Lorenzo felt something he hadn't in years: doubt. He looked at Emily, her face pale and strained from the pain, and a strange tenderness settled in his chest. This wasn't the world he was accustomed to, but for some reason he couldn't bring himself to leave. The sounds of the hospital, the faint beeping of the machines, became a background to the weight of his decision. Was this some sort of fate, a mistake that had led him here? He didn't know, but in that moment, he made a choice that surprised him more than anyone else. He wasn't just here because of a wrong number. He was here because, for reasons he couldn't explain, Emily needed him, and in this moment, maybe, just maybe, he needed her too. Lorenzo's thoughts circled back to his sister. The memory of her final words, her final moments alone in that hospital room, came rushing back to him. He had failed her, he had abandoned her, and no matter how many years passed, he would never be able to shake that guilt. He had promised himself he would never fail anyone again. But this wasn't the same. Emily wasn't his sister, Lily wasn't her, and yet the connection he felt in this room was undeniable. He glanced at Emily again, her eyes now closed in exhausted sleep, and he felt a strange pull in his chest. His life would never be the same again. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore, not in this room, not with her. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to wonder if he could change, if there was even a chance for redemption in this strange, unexpected place. Without saying another word, he leaned back in the chair, his gaze lingering on Emily and Lily as the hours of the night stretched on in silence. The soft click of the door latch stirred Emily from her shallow sleep, pulling her from the hazy fog that had settled over her mind. She blinked against the harsh light seeping through the hospital blinds. The quiet rhythm of the heart monitor next to her head, a constant reminder of how fragile her body had become. Her muscles ached from the strain of everything, the treatment, the exhaustion, and most of all, the weight of the truth she had yet to fully accept. But as she slowly turned her head to find the familiar form of Lorenzo still seated beside her, something in her chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and confusion swelling in her heart. She had not imagined him leaving. He was too much of a man who lived by his own rules to just disappear. But she hadn't expected to find comfort in his presence either. And yet here he was, sitting as still as a statue, his posture perfect and unyielding, yet something softer in his gaze when he looked at her. Lily, too, was still curled up in her chair, clutching her tattered teddy bear in her sleep. Her small form, so innocent, so untainted by the world around her, filled Emily's heart with a sense of quiet peace. Lily had no idea how much danger loomed over them, how much her mother was struggling just to stay afloat. But Emily knew, she had known for a long time, that the storm brewing inside her was inevitable. And now, with the fear of losing her daughter to a broken system, Emily found herself at her breaking point. She shifted in bed, wincing slightly from the pain. The medication had dulled her senses, but could do little to numb the emotional weight that pressed on her chest. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. Lorenzo hadn't spoken much after that first night. His presence had been silent but constant, a steady source of unexpected comfort. But tonight, she knew she couldn't remain silent any longer. The weight of her reality needed to be shared, and there was something about him, something in the way he'd sate with her, never judging, never rushing her, that made her feel like she could trust him. For the first time in months, Emily allowed herself to be vulnerable, to open up about the pain she'd hidden for so long. She turned to him, his eyes fixed on the floor, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the chair, as if caught in a rhythm only he could hear. "Lorenzo," she began, her voice weak but steady. I need to tell you something." Lorenzo's gaze snapped to hers, his expression softening. He didn't speak, just nodded, his quiet acknowledgement giving her the courage to continue. "I'm sick," she said, her words like stones rolling off her tongue, heavy with truth. "Stage 3 cancer." She swallowed, her eyes flicking to the floor before meeting his again. "The prognosis isn't good." There was a long silence between them, filled only with the faint beeping of the machines that surrounded her. Lorenzo's expression remained unreadable, but Emily could feel the weight of his focus on her, his quiet attention urging her to go on. "I've been fighting it for a year now," she continued, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "But my body, it's failing me. I'm running out of time, Lorenzo." Her voice caught in her throat as she said the words. She had said them before, but it never made it easier. "I've tried everything, treatment, diet, prayer, but I'm still losing, and I know it." Lorenzo didn't speak, didn't move, but she could see his jaw tighten, the subtle flicker of pain in his eyes. He wasn't used to hearing the word losing attached to someone as strong as Emily. He had built his entire life on strength, power, survival. This woman lying in front of him, so vulnerable, so open, didn't seem like someone who would let life take her so easily. But there was more, Emily knew. There was always more. "I don't have anyone left," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "My ex, Lily's father, he left when he found out. He couldn't handle it, couldn't handle me being sick. I was alone in this from the moment I got the diagnosis." She paused, the weight of the words sinking deep into her. "And now the state is threatening to take Lily away. They say I'm not fit to care for her. They want to put her in foster care. They say I can't protect her." Lorenzo's eyes darkened as he absorbed her words. The silence between them felt suffocating, the magnitude of her situation clear. It wasn't just her health, there was more at stake now. A life, a future, a child who had no one but her mother, and here he was, sitting in the chair by her side, a man whose entire existence was built on violence and fear, now facing the reality of a woman whose greatest battle wasn't against the world, it was against time. For the first time in a long time, Lorenzo found himself questioning the world he had created for himself. The life he had built, the power he wielded, all of it felt irrelevant in this room. This wasn't a mafia negotiation. This wasn't a turf war or a power struggle. This was something deeper, more human than he had ever allowed himself to acknowledge. As the minutes stretched on, Lorenzo sat quietly, his mind working at a pace he couldn't quite keep up with. He had listened to countless people over the years, pleas for protection, requests for mercy, desperate cries for help, but nothing had ever hit him like this. Nothing had ever made him feel so helpless. He wasn't used to helplessness. He had built his empire from the ground up, overcoming every obstacle in his path with force, with violence, with sheer will. He had never stopped to ask if anyone needed saving. He was the one who did the saving. And yet, as he sat in this small hospital room watching Emily, her words sinking deeper into him than he cared to admit, he realized something had changed. She wasn't just a woman in need. She wasn't some damsel in distress waiting to be rescued. Emily was a fighter, a woman who had endured more than anyone should have to. And yet here she was, still standing, still breathing, still fighting for her daughter. Lorenzo felt something stir inside him. It wasn't pity, it wasn't sympathy, it was something else. A deep, gnawing urge to protect her, to shield her and Lily from the storm that was threatening to tear their world apart. He had never felt this before, not for anyone, certainly not for a stranger. "Emily," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "You're not alone in this, not anymore." As the conversation lulled, the soft rustling of sheets caught both Emily and Lorenzo's attention. Lily, still half asleep, began to stir in the chair beside her mother's bed. The teddy bear she had been clutching so tightly shifted in her hands as she blinked up at them, her wide, innocent eyes taking in the unfamiliar figure in the room. "Mommy?" Lily's voice was soft, hoarse from sleep, and her gaze shifted from Emily to Lorenzo. She tilted her head, her small brows furrowing in curiosity. "Who are you?" Lorenzo could feel the weight of the question, the simple innocence in her voice striking him like a sharp, unexpected blow. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could find the words, Lily's next question stopped him in his tracks. "Are you the angel Mommy prayed for?" The question hit him harder than he could have ever anticipated. A small child, with no knowledge of the world, no understanding of the violence and darkness that surrounded them, could see something in him, something he had long buried. The innocence in her words left him speechless for a moment. He swallowed hard, his throat constricting. "I'm not an angel, sweet girl," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "But I'm here to help. I'll always be here for you and your mommy." Lily didn't seem to question him further. Instead, she smiled brightly and scooted closer to her mother's bed. "You can stay, right? Mommy says you're staying." Lorenzo glanced at Emily, whose tired eyes were filled with unshed tears. Her daughter's trust was unconditional, and that made him feel something deep, something that wasn't born of violence or power, but of something pure. "Enzo," Lily added, her tiny voice full of wonder. "You're Enzo, right?" Lorenzo's heart skipped a beat. Enzo, a name that only his sister had ever used for him. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, a name that carried memories of a time before the bloodshed, before the coldness of his world had taken over. "Yes," he whispered, almost without thinking. "I'm Enzo." And in that moment, as Lily's bright, trusting eyes met his, something inside Lorenzo shifted irrevocably. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was becoming something else, something he didn't fully understand. But it felt like the right thing to do. Emily's struggle had become his. Lily's innocence had started to heal a part of him he thought was lost forever. And as he sat there, watching the small family before him, he realized that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The soft hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights was interrupted by the sharp sound of the door clicking open. Emily's eyes fluttered open from a light sleep, her mind still hazy from the medication, but her body aching with every movement. She glanced toward the door, expecting another nurse or doctor, but instead her heart sank when she saw a figure she hadn't anticipated. Jake. Her ex-boyfriend stood in the doorway, a scowl on Mari's face, his posture rigid, his jaw set with determination. Behind him, a man in a suit stood, his lawyer, no doubt, ready to fight whatever battle Jake had in mind. Emily's pulse quickened. The sight of him was enough to make her stomach churn. He had disappeared the moment he learned of her diagnosis, leaving her to face the harsh reality of being a single mother with no support. But now here he was, strolling into her hospital room like he had every right to be there. "Jake," Emily muttered, trying to keep her voice steady as she shifted uncomfortably in her bed. He didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her with a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine. He hadn't changed. Still the same man who had walked out on her without a second thought. The same man who had abandoned Lily without so much as a goodbye. "You're in no condition to be making decisions for Lily," Jake said, his voice low but firm. He stepped forward, ignoring the fact that Emily hadn't invited him into the room. "I've got a lawyer here. I'm claiming parental rights. She's my daughter, too." Emily's heart dropped. The fear she had been keeping at bay for so long began to swell in her chest. She had always known this day would come, the day Jake would show up, demanding custody of Lily, but the reality of it was still like a punch to the gut. She couldn't fight him, not now. Not with the illness weighing her down and the state already threatening to take Lily from her. "I know you're going through something right now," Jake continued, his voice dripping with false concern, "but I need to make sure Lily's raised properly. With everything you've got going on—" He trailed off, clearly calculating his next words. "She deserves a stable home, a real father." Emily opened her mouth to protest, to tell him he had no right, but her throat tightened. Her voice lost to the fear and helplessness swelling inside her. She glanced at Lily, still asleep in the chair beside her bed, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking in the room. The thought of losing her daughter, of handing Lily over to the man who had abandoned them both, made her stomach churn. Before she could say anything more, the lawyer stepped forward, handing Emily a stack of papers. "These are the documents to begin the process," he said, his tone professional, detached. "We'll need signatures for the custody agreement, and then we will be taking the matter to court. Your ex has rights, Ms. Carter." Emily looked at the papers in her hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed over the top of the document. Everything she feared was laid out in front of her. The hospital bill, the looming possibility of losing Lily. She felt trapped, cornered by a system that would never understand the love and care she had for her daughter. But then a new voice cut through the tension in the room. "Not so fast." Lorenzo's presence filled the space, his deep voice commanding and unwavering. He stood in the doorway now, his broad shoulders squared, his dark suit sharp against the sterile hospital room. There was an aura of authority about him, a calmness in the face of Emily's unraveling world. Jake turned to face him, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "And who the hell are you?" Lorenzo didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He stepped further into the room, his gaze never leaving Jake's. His eyes were cold, calculating, as though he were sizing up the situation with careful precision. "I'm Lily's guardian," Lorenzo stated, his voice unyielding. He didn't wait for a response before he reached into his pocket, pulling out a ring, a gold band that gleamed in the dim light. "I'm also her fiancé." Emily's heart stopped for a moment. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected him to say that. She stared at the ring in his hand, its polished surface catching the light in a way that almost seemed too perfect, too final. Lorenzo's mother's engagement ring, no less. Jake's eyebrows furrowed in confusion, his gaze flickering between Emily and Lorenzo. "What is this, some kind of joke?" "Not a joke," Lorenzo replied smoothly. He walked closer, his dark eyes unwavering. "I'm here because Emily and Lily are under my protection, and I don't take kindly to people threatening my family." There was no denying the edge in his voice, the promise of violence beneath the calm exterior. Emily could feel the tension rising in the room, the air thick with unspoken power. The lawyer shifted uneasily, his eyes darting from Lorenzo to Jake, sensing the shift in the room's dynamics. Emily looked at Lorenzo, her mind reeling. Was he really doing this? Was he actually standing up for her and Lily like this? "I don't care if you have a ring or not," Jake snapped. His jaw clenched. "I'll still fight you. Lily is my daughter. You can't just come in here and claim—" "Enough," Lorenzo cut him off, his tone sharp as a whip. "We don't need to waste time. You'll leave this room and go back to wherever you came from. And when you're ready to fight for your daughter, You can do it legally, but not today. Jake opened his mouth to argue, but Lorenzo's presence was too overwhelming. The Mafia boss wasn't just intimidating, he was unwavering, a force of nature that couldn't be easily challenged. Jake's shoulders slumped, a defeat Emily couldn't have predicted washing over him. He looked to his lawyer, who gave him a reluctant nod, before he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. Lorenzo didn't move, his eyes still fixed on the door, as if daring anyone else to enter and challenge his claim. The lawyer hesitated for a moment before following, leaving the two of them in the tense silence that lingered in the air. Emily exhaled shakily, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She had thought Jake was the worst threat she would face, but now she wasn't so sure. She looked up at Lorenzo, who stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. Why did you do that?" she asked softly, her voice still raw from the exchange. Lorenzo glanced at her, his gaze softening only slightly. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes flicking over to Lily, who was still curled up in the chair, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the room. "Because," he said quietly, "she's mine to protect, and so are you." As the days passed, the initial chaos settled into a strange sort of routine. Emily's health was still fragile, and the fear of losing Lily to the system lingered like a shadow over everything. But with Lorenzo's presence, Emily began to feel an odd sense of stability, like a storm had passed, and for once, she could catch her breath. Lily, too, began to adjust to the new presence in their lives. The once quiet little girl had warmed to Lorenzo in ways Emily never expected. Each morning she would climb into bed with Emily and sit beside her, holding her teddy bear tightly, and would ask in her soft, trusting voice, "Is Enzo coming today?" Lorenzo had, without question, accepted the role of Enzo in Lily's life, even if it wasn't something he had ever imagined. He found himself doing things he had never expected to, learning to braid Lily's hair, reading her bedtime stories, and talking to her in the way a father would, even though he hadn't been given that title. The first time he had braided Lily's hair, he had been clumsy, fingers fumbling with the strands of golden brown locks, but Lily had giggled and assured him that he was doing it just right. The innocence in her eyes, the trust she placed in him without question, softened something in Lorenzo's chest, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. As days turned into weeks, Emily noticed the change in both of them. Lorenzo wasn't the same man who had walked into that hospital room weeks ago. He had become something else, something more than a mafia boss. He was becoming the protector Emily had desperately needed, and Lily was growing fond of him in a way that made Emily both grateful and terrified. She couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of a lie that would become their truth? Or was it something even more unexpected, something they both needed despite the dangers it would undoubtedly bring? Lorenzo was staying, and for now that was enough. The low hum of the hospital room's air conditioning was a steady presence, mingling with the soft shuffle of footsteps and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor beside Emily's bed. Her body had begun to feel like a stranger, frail, worn out, and continuously betrayed by the illness inside her. But despite the physical toll, her mind had started to clear. The medication still made her head foggy, but Lorenzo's presence, strange and unexpected, had started to settle into a familiar, almost comforting part of her life. She no longer felt like she was living in a world where everything was falling apart. Lily had grown more attached to Lorenzo every day, calling him Enzo with an innocent trust that Emily didn't dare disturb, and she found herself relying on him more than she cared to admit, especially now that the fear of losing her daughter had become too real. The lie that had started as an excuse had somehow transformed into their reality. Lorenzo had stepped into their world as if he were meant to be there, unquestionably protective, quietly present. But as time went on, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something she didn't know about him, something he hadn't shared. It was a late afternoon when Emily overheard the conversation that would change everything. She had been trying to sleep, though rest was elusive. The pain from her treatments had started to return, an ache deep in her bones that kept her awake more often than not. The hospital room felt suffocating, and she longed for the comfort of her small apartment, the one place she felt some semblance of control. The sound of Lorenzo's voice, muffled from the hallway, caught her attention. She wasn't sure why she listened, but the quiet undertones of the conversation seemed to pull her in. She hadn't expected to hear much, but what she did hear sent a chill down her spine. Lorenzo's voice, low and controlled, drifted through the crack in the door. "Get the shipment ready. I'll handle it personally." There was a pause before the voice on the other end responded, too quiet for Emily to make out. Lorenzo's next words made her heart race. "I'm not letting anyone touch her. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her safe. You know that." The words hung in the air, a promise of something dark, something dangerous. She didn't know who he was talking to or who the shipment was, but the tone in his voice, the weight of it, told her everything she needed to know. The reality of who he was, of what he did, was starting to sink in. Her breath hitched in her chest, and the room suddenly felt too small. The man she had come to trust, the one who had protected her and Lily without question, was tied to something she didn't understand, something far beyond what she was ready to confront. Her mind raced as she pieced the fragments together, his cold demeanor, his ability to command a room, the power he exuded without effort. He wasn't just some wealthy businessman, he wasn't just a guardian to her and Lily. He was someone else, someone dangerous. When Lorenzo returned to the room later that evening, Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the edge of the sheets as she waited for him. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her thoughts were clouded with a mixture of fear and confusion. She couldn't ignore the truth anymore. She needed answers. As he walked in, his eyes briefly met hers, and for a split second she saw the vulnerability in them, the same vulnerability she had seen when he was with Lily. But this time it was different. This time it was a challenge. He had come into their world, had chosen to protect them, but Emily couldn't ignore the reality of who he was any longer. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice steady but filled with an emotion she couldn't name. "I need to know the truth." Lorenzo paused, his expression shifting. He knew this moment was coming. He'd known it ever since he'd stepped foot into the hospital room that night. He had hoped to keep his past buried, to keep Emily and Lily safe from the world he had left behind. But that wasn't possible now, not with her asking the questions, not with the lies becoming their reality. "I overheard you talking," Emily continued, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "Who were you speaking to? What's going on? What world are you a part of?" For a moment, Lorenzo said nothing. He looked down at the floor, as if weighing his words carefully. But when he looked up, there was no avoiding it anymore. The truth was out there, hanging in the air between them. "I didn't want you to know," he said quietly. "I didn't want to drag you into my world. But it's not something I can hide from you anymore. You deserve to know." He stepped closer to her, his expression serious, the weight of his past now apparent in the lines of his face. "I'm not just some businessman, Emily. I'm a Mafia boss. The Moretti family controls a significant portion of this city, its businesses, its criminal enterprises, and that's the life I've lived for years." The words hit Emily like a slap. She felt her stomach drop, the reality of the situation crashing over her in waves. The man who had promised to protect them, who had made her feel safe for the first time in what felt like forever, was tied to the very thing she had tried to escape her entire life. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you come to me, to us?" Lorenzo's eyes softened, and he ran a hand through his dark hair, the tension in his shoulders evident. "I didn't expect to get involved with you. I didn't expect to care, but something about you, about Lily, I couldn't ignore it. When I heard you on the phone that night, I knew I had to help. I couldn't walk away, not from you, not from her." Emily's mind was racing, but there was a strange clarity in her heart, despite the fear that twisted in her chest. Despite the overwhelming truth of his past, she wasn't scared of him. The man she had come to know, who had held her hand when she cried, who had made sure Lily was safe, was still the same person in front of her. "I'm not the man I used to be," he added, his voice barely audible, "but that doesn't change the fact that I'm in this world, and it doesn't change the danger you and Lily are in because of me." Emily stared at him, her thoughts swirling, but her heart told her to trust him. She had seen the gentleness in him. She had seen it in the way he cared for Lily, the way he held her when she cried, the way he read bedtime stories with patience and tenderness. Lorenzo wasn't just the man from the shadows. He was more than that. She believed in him. "I don't care about your past," Emily said softly. "I care about what you've done for us. I care about the man you've shown me you can be. You're not your past, Lorenzo. You're here, and that's what matters." Lorenzo looked at her, his chest tightening. He hadn't expected that. He had expected fear, maybe rejection. But Emily didn't run. She didn't judge him for the life he had lived. Instead, she accepted him, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past begin to lift. The next morning, as Emily lay back in her bed, recovering from another round of treatment, the sound of soft footsteps reached her ears. She turned her head and saw Lily, her blonde hair tousled from sleep, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide and filled with wonder, locked onto Lorenzo, who was sitting across the room, flipping through a book with a look of quiet concentration. "Enzo." Lily's voice was soft, as if she were unsure of how to approach him. Lorenzo looked up, his expression shifting from the seriousness of the conversation to something gentler, something warmer. He smiled, a small, fleeting gesture that reached his eyes as he beckoned her over. "Good morning, Lily," he said, his voice soft, tender. "Did you sleep well?" Lily nodded, a bright smile tugging at her lips. She climbed into the chair next to him, her teddy bear still in her arms. "I had a good dream," she said, her voice full of trust and innocence. "You were there, Enzo. You were with me." Lorenzo's heart clenched in his chest. He hadn't known how to respond to that, how to explain to this little girl that he wasn't supposed to be here, that he wasn't supposed to care for her, but the truth was, he already did. He had been pulled into their world, not by choice, but by something stronger, his own need to protect them, to care for them in ways he had never allowed himself to care before. Lily looked up at him again, her innocent eyes searching his face. "Enzo, will you stay forever?" Lorenzo's breath caught. The question, so simple yet filled with so much trust, sent a wave of emotion through him. He looked over at Emily, who was watching them with a quiet smile on her face, and in that moment, he realized something that scared him more than anything else. He couldn't imagine leaving. "I'll stay," he said softly, his voice steady, "as long as you need me." And with that, for the first time, Lorenzo understood what it meant to be part of something greater than himself. He wasn't just the protector. He wasn't just the man from the shadows. He was their family now, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The weight of silence filled the air that night, settling over the apartment like a heavy blanket. Lorenzo sat in the living room, his gaze locked on the dark window, his mind churning with thoughts he didn't want to face. Emily was in the bedroom, resting, her breathing shallow but steady. Lily was asleep in her bed, the quiet innocence of her dreams a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to suffocate the room. Lorenzo could feel the storm brewing, a familiar danger inching closer, but this time it wasn't just his life at risk. It was theirs, Emily's and Lily's. He had always lived in the shadows, moving in the world of the Mafia with ease. But now, with them in his life, everything had changed, and his past was not going to let him forget it. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, and the chill that ran through him was immediate. He knew who it was before he even looked at the screen. It was Dante Russo. The name alone made his blood run cold. Dante was not just a rival, he was a ruthless predator who would stop at nothing to take what he wanted. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just business. Dante knew about Emily and Lily, and Lorenzo's attachment to them had put them squarely in his crosshairs. The message from Dante was brief, but the threat was unmistakable. Come to the old warehouse on 7th and Clark. You bring your family. You all walk out or you don't. It's your choice, Lorenzo. Be there at midnight. Lorenzo's fist clenched around the phone as his heart pounded in his chest. He had known this day would come, the moment when his ties to the underworld would jeopardize the one thing he had come to care about more than anything else. But to see Emily and Lily dragged into this world, threatened by the very people he had fought his entire life to keep at bay, sent a rush of guilt and fury through him. He stood up abruptly, his mind racing, trying to think through the mess of emotions swirling inside him. He had to protect them. He had no choice. But how? How could he protect them without falling back into the very thing he had been trying to escape? The Mafia had always been a part of him, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. Could he just walk away from it? Could he dismantle everything he had built, everything his father had left him, just to keep Emily and Lily safe? Lorenzo's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of his phone ringing again. He didn't need to look at the screen this time to know it was Dante. His mind flashed back to a time when this kind of confrontation was nothing but a casual part of his life. Back then, when his world was ruled by power and intimidation, he had always chosen the Mafia. There had been no question. Loyalty to the family, to the empire his father had built, was the only thing that mattered. But now, as his heart thundered in his chest, he couldn't stop the deep sense of dread settling in his stomach. Dante had crossed a line by threatening Emily and Lily. He had dragged them into a world they didn't belong in, a world that would devour them without hesitation, and Lorenzo knew deep down that his choices would determine their fate. He answered the call, his voice low and steady, hiding the storm brewing inside him. "What do you want, Dante?" Dante's voice was smug, dripping with the satisfaction of knowing he had Lorenzo exactly where he wanted him. "I want what's mine, Moretti. You know how this works. You've built your little family, but you're still part of my world. You think you can just walk away? You think you can just leave and take what's mine?" Lorenzo gritted his teeth. "I'm not your property, Dante. I'm not part of your world anymore." Dante laughed, the sound grating. "That's where you're wrong, Lorenzo. You'll always be part of it, and now you've brought them into it, the woman and the child, their leverage. And you'll come to me, or they'll pay the price for your little fantasy of being someone else." Lorenzo's hands tightened into fists, the veins in his neck bulging. He could hear Dante's amusement, hear the satisfaction in his voice as he dangled Emily and Lily's safety like a carrot on a string. "If you harm them, Dante," Lorenzo growled, his voice deadly calm, "I'll burn your empire to the ground." Dante's laughter faded, replaced by a cold, threatening tone. "We'll see, won't we? You'll come alone, or the choice will be made for you." The call ended abruptly, leaving Lorenzo standing there, staring at the dark screen of his phone. His breath was heavy, his pulse racing as the weight of the situation crashed over him. The decision was inescapable. It was time to choose. He had never been one to shy away from hard choices. But this was different. For the first time in his life, he was being asked to choose between the only world he had ever known and something he had never allowed himself to desire: a family, a future, a chance at redemption. Lorenzo paced the small living room, the walls closing in on him as he tried to clear his thoughts. Emily, Lily, they didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to be pulled into his violent, dangerous life. He had promised to protect them, and now that promise felt like a weight he couldn't carry. But he knew what he had to do. He knew what the only choice was. He could no longer live a double life, straddling two worlds that would never coexist peacefully. He could no longer let the Mafia control him, dictate his every move. He had made a promise to Emily, to Lily, and he was going to keep it, no matter what the cost. He walked to the bedroom, where Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and tired from the long days of treatment. She looked up at him as he entered, her eyes filled with concern. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had seen the way Lorenzo had changed over the past weeks, the way his walls had cracked, how he had become more than just a protector. But this was different. She could see it in his eyes. Lorenzo didn't speak at first. He didn't know where to start. The truth, the real truth, was too complicated, but there was no room for hiding anymore. "Dante knows about you and Lily," he said quietly, his gaze steady but filled with an undeniable regret. "He knows I've attached myself to you, and he's using you both as leverage." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had feared something like this, but hearing it out loud made it real, made it unavoidable. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes searching his face, waiting for him to tell her what his next move was. "I have a choice to make," he said slowly. "I can go to him, do what he asks, and try to protect you both. Or I can turn my back on everything, on the Mafia, on the life I've built, and fight for you, for us." Emily's heart raced. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and yet she didn't hesitate. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his. "What will you choose?" Lorenzo looked down at her hand, then back into her eyes, and for the first time he wasn't thinking about the empire he had built, or the bloodshed he had left in his wake. He was thinking about her, about Lily, and for the first time he felt something deep within him that wasn't driven by power, fear, or guilt. "I'm choosing you," he said, his voice filled with a resolve that shook her to the core. "I'm choosing both of you. I'm going to dismantle everything. I'm going to walk away from the Mafia for good, for you and Lily. I'll destroy it all if it means you're safe." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she squeezed his hand. She didn't know how he was going to do it, didn't know what the fallout would be, but she knew one thing: he was choosing them, and that was all she needed. Lorenzo stood up, taking a deep breath as he prepared himself for what lay ahead. The call to Dante was inevitable. The confrontation was coming, but for the first time in his life, he was ready to face it, not as a Mafia boss, but as a man willing to sacrifice everything for the family he had unexpectedly found. He turned to Emily, his expression resolute. "This is the last thing I'll do in that world. I'll burn it all down for you." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I believe you." And in that moment, Lorenzo knew there was no turning back. His ultimate choice had been made. For Emily, for Lily, for a future they hadn't even dared to dream of until now. The early morning light filtered through the blinds of the small apartment, casting long shadows across the walls. It was peaceful, quieter than it had been in a long time. Emily sat at the kitchen table, a mug of tea cradled in her hands, the warmth of the liquid spreading through her veins like comfort she hadn't known in months. She was starting to feel stronger, more like herself, as her body slowly responded to the treatments. There was a sense of normalcy in the air, a delicate balance between hope and fear, as if the world had paused for just a moment. Lily sat across from her, coloring in a book, her small fingers wrapped around the crayon with a concentration that made Emily smile. It was the first time in a long while that the quiet had felt like peace and not the ominous calm before a storm. But there was something Emily couldn't shake, a whisper of unease that lingered at the back of her mind. Ever since Lorenzo had made his choice, had vowed to walk away from the Mafia to protect them, Emily had felt the weight of that decision in every corner of their lives. She knew the price of safety in his world. She had seen the tension in his shoulders, the dark look in his eyes when he spoke of his past. The Mafia didn't just let people go, it didn't allow for clean exits. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door clicking, a quick, sharp sound that didn't fit with the rhythm of the day. Emily's head snapped toward the door, her heart skipping a beat. She knew that sound. She had heard it 1,000 times before in the world she had tried to leave behind. Someone was here. Her pulse quickened. It could have been nothing, just a mistake, a neighbor, but the feeling in her chest told her otherwise. Her hand tightened around the mug, a sense of dread creeping up her spine. Lorenzo was still out, handling something he had refused to tell Emily about earlier that morning. He had been distant lately, as if the weight of his decision to leave the Mafia had begun to weigh on him in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. But he had made his choice. He had made it clear that he was leaving behind everything to protect Emily and Lily, and Emily believed him. She had no reason not to. But as the door clicked again, louder this time, her breath caught in her throat. This time, it wasn't the door to the apartment, but the sound of the building's main entrance opening, followed by footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, as if they were waiting for the moment when everything would explode. Lily looked up from her coloring book, her innocent eyes filled with curiosity. "Mommy, who's at the door?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she rose slowly, setting the mug down on the counter. She moved to the window, peering through the blinds. A black van was parked just outside, too close for comfort. The street was empty, no pedestrians, no cars passing by. Only the van and the ominous presence of it that made Emily's stomach churn. She stepped back from the window, her eyes wild with panic. "Lily, get back in your room, now!" Lily's wide eyes locked onto her mother's, sensing the tension in the air. "Mommy, what's wrong?" "Please," Emily whispered, trying to stay calm, but the shaking in her hands betrayed her. "Just do as I say. Get in your room, now." Lily's small feet moved quickly across the floor, her tiny body disappearing down the hallway toward her bedroom. Emily's heart sank, knowing that if anything happened to Lily, she wouldn't forgive herself. But there was nothing more she could do now. She had to keep her safe. The front door burst open and 2 masked men stormed into the apartment. Emily barely had time to react before one of them grabbed her by the arm, spinning her around and pinning her to the wall. The other rushed past, heading straight toward Lily's bedroom. "No!" Emily screamed, struggling against the grip that held her. She fought, tried to pull away, but the man's hold was too strong. "Don't hurt her! She's just a little girl!" The man's grip tightened, his voice cold and flat. "She's not the one we're after." Just as Emily's heart dropped to the floor, the front door slammed open again, and Lorenzo appeared in the hallway. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the situation in an instant. Without a second thought, he sprang into action, his movements calculated and deadly. "Let her go," Lorenzo's voice boomed, commanding. "Now!" The man holding Emily hesitated for a split second, just long enough for Lorenzo to close the distance between them. In one swift motion, he yanked the man's arm away, sending him crashing into the wall. The sound of bones cracking echoed through the apartment. Lorenzo turned toward the bedroom where Lily was, his gaze hard, his jaw clenched with a rage that was barely contained. The man in the room was already grabbing for Lily, but before he could get close enough, Lorenzo was there, his body like a shield between the man and the child. Lily screamed, running toward her mother as Lorenzo took down the second man with a swift punch. The man collapsed to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the ground. Lorenzo immediately turned to Lily, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, sobbing, her small hands grasping at his shirt, as if he were the only thing holding her together. "Lily, you're safe. You're safe now," Lorenzo said, his voice softer but no less fierce. He looked at Emily, his eyes wild with concern. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she wiped away the tears that had gathered in her eyes. She couldn't speak, couldn't form the words as she watched Lorenzo cradle Lily, the small girl finding comfort in his arms. For a moment, everything else faded. There were no Mafia families, no danger hanging over their heads. There was only them, the 3 of them, and the knowledge that they had survived. The men were subdued and tied up, left in the hallway as Lorenzo prepared to make the call. His jaw was tight, his hands steady, but there was a glint of fury in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He stood at the kitchen counter, the phone pressed to his ear, his eyes never leaving Emily as she sat in the living room, still holding on to Lily. "I know you're behind this, Dante," Lorenzo said, his voice low, controlled, but with a simmering anger beneath. "You've crossed the line this time. No more threats, no more games." On the other end, Dante's voice oozed with amusement, the mocking tone clear even through the phone. "Did you really think you could walk away from everything, Lorenzo? Did you think I wouldn't come for what's mine?" "You've gone too far," Lorenzo replied, his grip tightening on the phone. "You've brought them into this, and now you'll pay for it." Dante chuckled, as if the threat of violence didn't faze him. "You're still part of this world, Moretti. You'll never escape it. But now you've made it personal. You know what happens when people make things personal, don't you?" Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. "I'm done with the Mafia, Dante. I'm done with the legacy my father left. I'm walking away. You can have the empire, you can have everything, but not her, not Lily, not Emily." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, the weight of Lorenzo's words settling between them. "Walk away?" Dante's voice was incredulous. "You're a fool, Lorenzo. You think you can just walk away from everything you've built? You think you can just give it up for some woman and a child? You'll pay for that decision. You'll regret it." Lorenzo didn't flinch. "I don't regret it. I made a choice, and I'm sticking to it." "I'll give you one chance." "Moretti," Dante said, his tone changing, growing more dangerous. "Meet me tomorrow at the warehouse on 7th and Clark. We'll settle this once and for all." Lorenzo's response was cold, final. "This ends now, Dante. I'm not coming for you. I'm not fighting for this empire anymore. The only thing I'm fighting for is them. You'll leave them alone, or I'll make you regret it." The weight of the decision settled over Lorenzo like a heavy shroud. He had made the choice to walk away from the Mafia, to dismantle everything his father had built, but that didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. Dante was ruthless, and Lorenzo knew that any show of weakness could be his undoing, but he also knew that no matter what happened next, he would never go back to that life. As the hours passed, Lorenzo prepared for the final showdown. He wasn't sure how it would end, but he was certain of one thing. He had already made his choice. He wasn't going to lose Emily and Lily, not to the Mafia, not to anyone. When he turned to Emily later that night after making the call to Dante, he saw the fear in her eyes. She knew what was coming, but she also knew without a doubt that Lorenzo would do anything to keep them safe. "I'm not going back to that world," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "I'm done with it. For you, for Lily, I'll walk away from everything if it means you're safe." Emily nodded, her hand trembling as she reached for his. "I believe you." And in that moment, Lorenzo knew he had made the right choice, the only choice. The weight of the decision hung heavily in the air as Lorenzo sat at the table, his fingers absently tracing the polished surface of the old wood. The room was dimly lit, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the faces of the men surrounding him. These men, his family, the 5 families, were the ones who had shaped his life, who had made him who he was. They had been his allies, his partners, and, in many ways, his enemies. But today, they would be the ones who decided his future. Lorenzo had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions, who commanded respect. His father's empire had been his birthright, a legacy of power that had been passed down through generations. But now, as he sat across from these men, Lorenzo was no longer the feared Mafia boss who could snap his fingers and have entire lives wiped out in an instant. He was a man who had chosen something else. He had chosen Emily. He had chosen Lily, and now he was offering them the one thing he had never thought he would give up: everything. "Gentlemen," Lorenzo began, his voice low and steady, though a faint tremor ran through it that he couldn't quite hide. The years of violence, of power, of bloodshed had shaped him into a man who couldn't afford to show weakness. But today he allowed it to show just a little. "I've made my choice." The men around the table exchanged glances, their faces unreadable, but Lorenzo could feel the tension building. They had expected him to stand tall, to negotiate, to fight for his place in the underworld. But what he was offering them was something else entirely. "I'm done with this life," he said, the words heavy on his tongue. "I'm done with the Mafia, the empire my father built. Everything we've fought for, I'm walking away from it all. For them." He gestured toward the empty chair beside him where he imagined Emily and Lily sitting, their faces filled with uncertainty but also hope. "I'm giving you everything I've built, every business, every piece of land, every deal I've made. You can have it. But in exchange, I want one thing: their safety." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the men like a thick fog. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the men, Vincenzo, an older member of the families, leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. His eyes were cold, calculating, but there was something in them that Lorenzo couldn't quite decipher. "You're asking us to accept your exit from the life you've led? For how long?" Vincenzo's voice was sharp, a trace of disbelief lacing his words. "Since I was a boy," Lorenzo replied quietly, his voice not faltering. "I've lived by the rules of this world for far too long, and I've seen what it does to the people I love. I've seen it in my sister. I've seen it in you, all of you. It destroys everything, but I'm not letting it destroy her, not her, and not Lily." Lorenzo's hand slid into his jacket pocket, pulling out the small velvet box that had been with him for years. It was his father's ring, the symbol of the Moretti family, the symbol of everything Lorenzo had inherited. His father had worn it proudly, a constant reminder of the power he had built, the legacy he had left behind. But to Lorenzo, it had become nothing more than a reminder of the life he had to leave behind. He placed the ring on the table, the gold gleaming under the dim light. The room was quiet, the weight of the gesture sinking in. This ring, once a symbol of everything Lorenzo had stood for, now marked the end of it all. "I'm giving it to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm giving up everything, my power, my legacy. This is the last piece of my father's empire. You can have it, in exchange for their safety. For Emily, for Lily. I'm done. You're in control now." The men around the table didn't speak for a long while. Lorenzo could feel their eyes on him, weighing him, calculating the value of his words. But he didn't flinch. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had known would come, the moment he had chosen them. Finally, Vincenzo spoke, his voice low, but filled with an understanding that Lorenzo hadn't expected. "You've made your decision, Moretti, and you're right. This life, this empire, has taken enough from all of us. We'll take what's yours, but don't think for a second that we'll forget the debt. The price for your choice won't be paid in money, but in something else." Lorenzo nodded. He knew the cost. He knew what it meant to walk away from the Mafia, but he was willing to pay it, for Emily, for Lily. "I'll take my chances," he said, his voice unwavering, "but I'm done. This is my family now, and I'll fight for them with everything I have." 6 months passed, and the world Lorenzo had once known seemed like a distant memory. The apartment they had moved into was small, far from the opulence Lorenzo had grown accustomed to, but it was safe. It was theirs. And for the first time in his life, Lorenzo was at peace. Emily had blossomed over the months, her health improving, the color returning to her cheeks. The treatment had worked wonders, and though the journey was far from over, she was stronger than she had been in years. She had embraced the simple life they had built, no longer burdened by the constant weight of fear and uncertainty. Lily had grown too. She was no longer the quiet, unsure child who had clung to her teddy bear in the hospital room. Now she was the heart of their little family. Her laughter filled the house, her bright eyes never leaving her mother, or Enzo, as she called Lorenzo. The bond between them was undeniable, and Lorenzo found himself learning to be something he had never imagined, a father. One morning after the sun had risen and the house was quiet, Emily stood by the window, her hand resting on the kitchen counter. The smell of pancakes wafted through the air. Lorenzo had tried unsuccessfully to make them just right, but Emily didn't care. They were perfect in their imperfection. It didn't matter that Lorenzo couldn't cook, that their lives were nowhere near perfect. What mattered was that they were together. Lorenzo, dressed casually in jeans and a t-shirt, turned from the stove, flipping a pancake with far too much gusto, his face filled with a contentment he hadn't known he was capable of. Lily, dressed in her favorite pajamas, was sitting at the table, her feet swinging as she colored in a book, humming softly to herself. Emily's heart swelled as she watched the two of them. This was it. This was the life she had dreamed of, but never believed she could have. "Enzo," Lily said, glancing up at him with a grin, "you're doing it all wrong. Mommy says you're supposed to flip the pancakes like this." Lorenzo chuckled, his face breaking into a grin as he glanced over at Emily. She smiled back, her eyes soft with affection. "I'll get it right one of these days," he said, his voice full of amusement, but there was something deeper in his tone, something that spoke of peace, of finding the place he had been searching for all his life. Emily looked at him, her heart full, and as their eyes met, she whispered, "Stay." Lorenzo froze for a moment, his hand stilling over the pan. He didn't need to ask her to clarify. He knew exactly what she meant. "I've stayed," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion, "and I'll always stay." He walked over to her, his arms open, and she stepped into them, the warmth of his embrace filling the room. Lily giggled as she jumped out of her chair, running toward them. "Enzo, Mommy, can I have a hug too?" Lorenzo crouched down, lifting Lily into his arms as she wrapped her little arms around his neck, her tiny form fitting perfectly against him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the weight of his past. He didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. He simply felt complete. "I'm staying always," he said, holding them both close. "Always." And in that moment, as the warmth of the morning sun bathed them, Lorenzo realized that the family they had created was stronger than anything he had ever known. It had been forged not by blood or by plans, but by something far more powerful, love. And he had chosen them. For the first time in his life, he had chosen a future that was his own. The house was quiet, save for the soft sound of Lily's laughter and the hum of everyday life. They had found their rhythm, one that didn't revolve around power or violence, but around the simple moments that made life worth living. And though the shadows of his past would always be there, they no longer defined him. The final image of that day was one of contentment. Lorenzo, Emily, and Lily together, standing in the sunlight, their future ahead of them. No longer tied to the underworld, no longer burdened by the empire he had walked away from, Lorenzo had found the one thing he had been searching for all along, a family. And as he looked at Emily, her hand in his, and at Lily, who smiled up at him with the trust of a child who had never known fear, he knew one thing for sure: this was where he was meant to be. "Always," he whispered as they stepped forward together into the new life they had built, one that was theirs, forever. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an exciting new chapter. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Did you love the twist at the end? And as always, share this story with someone who could use a little love and redemption in their life. Stay tuned for more, and remember, sometimes the right choices come from the most unexpected places. See you next time.